Hi, I'm Kathleen Olive, and in this presentation, I'd like to introduce you to the culture of Renaissance garden building and introduce you to two gardens in particular from the 16th century in central Italy. So let's start with the culture of Renaissance villas and gardens. Here on the screen, you have the typical kind of patron of Renaissance villa and its garden. This is, as you can see from the colours and all of the fabrics and the trappings of the horses themselves, the hunting animals, the fortress-like castle villa in the background. This is not a pastime of the lower classes. So the average patron of a Renaissance villa and garden was someone from, at the very least, the upper middle classes. So someone with a great deal of wealth and power, and someone looking to make a statement about his wealth and power. I say his, but a number of Renaissance villas and gardens, the presiding genius behind them was, in fact, a woman, as we'll hear later. So, in this case, the particular patron you're looking at here is, of course, Cosimo de' Medici of the Medici dynasty in Florence. And shortly, we will hear about how they're really in the kind of ground level of this new emerging culture of villa building and the gardens that spread out from villas. This is not a new tradition for Italy, for the the territory of Italy. It was something that the ancient Romans had been interested in doing and did do all over the present day country of Italy. So if you visited places like Pompeii, you will have seen outside Pompeii at the Villa of the Mysteries examples of villas and gardens built during the Roman era, or perhaps you visited Hadrian's villa at Tivoli outside Rome. So this was a tradition that existed in Italy. It existed to celebrate an opposing kind of lifestyle. So the patrons of Roman villas and gardens were often men whose daily life involved negotium or business. Think about our word negotiate. They spent their day in transactions of some sort. And they wanted spaces where, in the beginning, they might have some kind of a hobby farm, some kind of a business engagement still, something still actively engaged in the economic and political life of their town. But increasingly, they wanted a space that wasn't to do with that kind of a transacting or active life. They wanted a place to indulge in their contemplative life, a place where they could spend their time in otium. So you can hear negotium, negotiate, and otium is kind of the non of that. So the life of sweet ease. Italian still has the word ozio, which comes from otium or otium and means this. So means kind of taking your time, spreading out, having time to relax, having time to enjoy yourself, having time to think. So a contemplative way of life as opposed to an active way of life. So this is how the ancient Romans saw a habit of what was called then from the Renaissance villeggiatura. We give it its Italian name, which is the idea of going out and making a villa for oneself. But over time, before in the centuries before the time of fabulous Cosimo de' Medici, who you've seen on your screen here, for the centuries between the fall of Rome, so from about the 6th century to about the 15th century, the time of Cosimo de' Medici, people living on mainland Italy are not really thinking about taking themselves out of a city into the country in order to live a life of sweet ease. And the reason they're not thinking about life like that is, first of all, they are incredibly urban. Cosimo de' Medici, his family comes from the country. They're peasants to begin with, but within a few generations, they're very much involved in the banking and money changing trades in Florence. And he's a case in point. This is, by the time we get to the 15th century, Italy is a very urban place. So, on the one hand, there's not a strong connection with the countryside in a kind of a symbolic way. But there's also not been a physical connection with the countryside for some time because it's been seen as a place of risk. So it's still obviously exploited for its agricultural potential, and that becomes quite important in Italy after the fall of the Roman Empire. But the countryside hasn't become for middle class people a place where they would really feel comfortable. They worry about things like marauding bands of soldiers. Maybe you can just make them out in this quite badly damaged fresco from the town hall of Siena, the so-called Room of Good and Bad Government, or the Room of Peace. Maybe you can see that in this scene, we see the countryside outside Siena, but it's not a place I'd want to be. Buildings are in ruins, so people aren't looking after the structures out in the countryside. Soldiers are moving across the landscape. They've laid waste to a village. You can see they've set it on fire. It's not really a place where I would want to be. You've got, functionally in the Middle Ages, you've got marauding bands of unpaid soldiers. When they're not fighting, they're pillaging the countryside to sustain themselves while they're without income. You've got roads that are falling into disrepair unless there's a great monastic community nearby who keeps the roads and the drainage ditches in good nick. Then you've got problems like malaria. And just overwhelmingly, industry and the growth of industry and the economy has encouraged people to move into cities. So the countryside has been abandoned over successive generations. People aren't thinking, I really aspire to a tree change. Wouldn't it be great to move into the countryside and spend some time out in the beautiful Tuscan hills? They're much more focused on staying inside city walls and feeling protected. So the first villas and gardens of the Renaissance, so from the 15th century, don't look as we would expect them to do. They look like a temporary refuge. I was going to say haven, but that's not even the right word. A refuge in the countryside, a place where you will go just temporarily in order to be able to do the best of what you can do in the countryside and then hurry back to your townhouse. So the first Renaissance villas emerge out of hunting lodges. This is one of the earliest. This is an early 15th century hunting lodge that belonged to the Borromeo family. Maybe you've been to the Borromean Islands on Lake Maggiore. That's subsequent dynasties of the same family, very extraordinary Baroque villas and gardens on those islands. But here we have a hunting lodge. They were based in Milan. This was an easy day's ride outside of Milan. And the central structure of this villa, you can see over time it grew, but the central structure is in the inset at the top of your screen on the left. In that image on the top left, on the right, you can see a squat little watchtower with two very stubby wings on either side of it. That's exactly what it is. It's a defensive tower with a very small room underneath that could be used. It's temporary. It's basically a tent made out of bricks. That's what it is. It's not a place where you're going to go and spend days upon days. It's a place where you just camp for a weekend at most and do the best of what there is to do in the country and then run back into Milan. Now, the best of what there is to do in the country, as the name suggests, is hunt. So men go to these places in order to hunt. Please believe me that on the left there, they are hunting a bear. They're not hunting a person in a bear suit, which is what this always looks like to me. These are men hunting a bear in what appears, it must be said, to be a very barbaric method of hunting. And then in the image, which is from a fresco on the walls of this hunting lodge, the Borromean hunting lodge, you can see they are hunting birds. They've built a lure around a pond. They've put a wicker fence around a boggy patch of ground and turned it into a pond so that birds are attracted. And then in that lure, they can net them and spear them, as you can see. So nature is being domesticated. Nature doesn't feel safe. I've got a tower to protect me when I'm out in the countryside. That's how unsafe I feel outside in the country. But if I can domesticate nature, put a fence around nature, pick up some rocks, and subdue nature, then I as a man, I can feel that I'm getting the best of what there is to being out in the countryside. For women in the countryside, in the early Renaissance villas and gardens, the pursuits are very passive. So we have in the Borromean hunting lodge that I showed you the exterior of, the frescoes where women are engaged show them doing pleasant things like, courting under a flowery arbor. It's a very rudimentary kind of garden. It's only temporary space, remember. And in other games, we see them, in other frescoes, we see them playing games like chess and cards. So women are doing very passive things, not really enjoying nature at all. And the men are only enjoying nature if they can feel safe. And this trend, kind of not really expanding out into nature, but living in a way that is very contained in a natural wild environment. This trend continues for a few generations. It continues arguably through much of the 15th century. So as I said, the Medici dynasty in Florence, they are at the forefront of villa and garden building culture in 15th century Italy. And even their earliest villas, which are on land they've purchased back in their homeland, back in the so-called Mugello or hills to the north. It's kind of the Apennines between Florence and Bologna. There is a valley known as the Mugello, and that's where the Medici came from. So they purchase property back in the Mugello and start to build on that. But even their earliest villas, you can see here, this is Cafaggiolo, one of the earliest. That is a walled, moated, fortified structure built, purpose built for this villa. It's not a structure that says, I feel super safe and comfortable out in the countryside. It's a structure that says, when I'm in the countryside, I need to feel protected by the same kind of urban structures that I would build if I felt under siege in a city. Nevertheless, villas like Cafaggiolo are set aside by the Medici for the same kinds of balanced purposes that the ancient Romans were building villas and gardens outside of cities for. So Cafaggiolo was a working farm, as you can see here in this 17th century depiction of the Medici villa, but it was a place explicitly for contemplation. So if you look at this illustration, you can see out the back there are quite extensive bedded gardens, and right at the back there's a water feature, and you can see a pergola in front of that. So a place where you just walk and sit and enjoy yourself. It's not purposeful. It's just a space for existing in a pleasant way. And then at the front of the villa, maybe you can see on our right, there's another water feature, and there's a topiried pavilion. So a place to shelter from the heat that's built out of a hedge, essentially. So yes, it's a farm. You can see the long buildings on the left, but it is a place for the contemplative life, or the vita contemplativa, the very same thing that the ancient Romans were seeking in their own villas, a kind of a balanced way of existence as a counterweight to the negotiated, transacted life of every day. And at Cafaggiolo, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who you see in the insets here, he spends quite a fair amount of time here as a teenager. The natural environment, the fresh air, it's all thought to be much more healthy for young people as long as they're, protected inside the fortress walls. His Greek tutor spends time with him out here, so he does a lot of study as a young man here. He goes for kind of short walks in nature that inspire him to write some quite lovely adolescent poetry. So although you need to feel safe, the idea of being out in the country is to enjoy oneself and also to kind of use one's mind for its highest pursuits. So philosophy, literature, and art. We see this at another great Medici villa, which is the villa at Careggi. Still somewhat of a fortress. This is again purpose built for the family in the 1440s by a favored architect, Michelozzo, and it has some element of a fortress. But that open air loggia at the top, a loggia is just for enjoying fresh air. It doesn't have a kind of a defensive purpose. Arguably, you're quite unsafe in a loggia. You're not protected in the way you would be in that machicolated tower block. So that loggia, we know from the inset, we know that members of the Medici family would gather there. They would discuss literature. They loved to talk about Plato, whose works were being newly translated from Greek in these Medici villas at this time. We know that Lorenzo the Magnificent would hold an annual birthday party for Plato on his birth date, his traditional birth date, out at this villa. And the reason there's an elevated open air loggia is so that while they were there, they could appreciate the parterre garden below, which doesn't survive. But this is something we're going to return to. Whenever you see a low parterre, you've got to have a higher perspective to look on it, because a parterre is nothingness when you're in it. A parterre's geometric effect and intricacy can only be appreciated if you can look down on it. So that was one of the other purposes of this loggia. The villa and the garden are speaking to one another. It's that Platonic book club, let's call it, that takes place at the villa at Careggi, which is today part of Florence's Careggi Hospital. It's precisely that culture that gives us great artworks like Primavera. Botticelli's Primavera and Birth of Venus, we know that both of them hung in Medici family villas quite soon after they were made, not immediately, but quite soon after they were made, they were decorations for villas. And the ideas that underpin both of those paintings come out of those Platonic book clubs that took place in the villas. So, an actual poem that was written by members of that Platonic club, together with newly translated works by Plato and Lucretius, directly inspire a 15th century poem that Botticelli then uses as the basis for the Birth of Venus, his painting. So as this villa culture and garden culture of the 15th century in Italy develops, what becomes clear is that it can create a sophisticated environment in all senses of the word. It's a sophisticated environment that allows powerful, wealthy, and busy businessmen and social leaders, cultural leaders, to take some time out and think in the most esoteric register of their lives. They're educated people, but their busy lives don't always give them space to indulge in that contemplative, philosophical dimension of their lives. It gives them comfortable and safe places that increasingly over the 15th century start to feel less fortress-like and open up more, as we've seen it at Careggi, the second of the Medici villas I showed you. And we also see that the spaces become more and more sophisticated, just from that small example of an open air loggia being a lovely place to sit and get the evening breeze in summer, but also the perfect viewing point to look down onto a low, geometrically set out garden. And so this is an indication to us that the gardens and villas of the Renaissance in Italy from the second half of the 15th century become more and more sophisticated. Now, the ones I've shown you so far are the lodges and then villas and gardens associated with people who are middle-class burghers, so mercantile folk. But the ones we'll look at now in Rome are associated with a very different kind of society, and that is the society of the papal court. The papal court functions in a very different hierarchical, structural way to the society of a mercantile city like Florence. So where the Medici are basing themselves when they go out and build their country villas and gardens, that's a city that favors open competition. It's ostensibly a republic, but its highest positions of power have a stranglehold over them exercised by wealthy businessmen like the Medici and their cronies. But ostensibly, it's a republic. Ostensibly, it embraces open competition across all facets of life, from artistic pursuit to business to ostensibly, but not really, politics. So that's one kind of a structure, a mercantile urban republican structure. In Rome, we have something else. In Rome, we have the equivalent of a king or an emperor. We have a court. So in Rome, we have one top dog, and that is a pope. Around the top dog, we have his right-hand men. We have, in the case of a papacy, cardinals. If we were talking about a monarchy, we might be talking about lords or barons. But when we're talking about the Pope, we're talking about the cardinals. They make up the inner echelon of the structure of power of the papacy around the Pope. And then each cardinal has his own court with a retinue of supporters and up and coming churchmen who want to be the next cardinal, who then want to be the next pope. And so instead, we have this kind of flower-like structure. I made that noise because it's such a beautiful kind of shape that we can give to this structure as a mind map, but it's actually quite a difficult striving culture. Renaissance Florence is a striving culture of competition in another way, but a papal court involves moving up through the ranks. And it's very hard to have a meteoric rise in a papal court. People do, and that's quite remarkable, frequently when they come from those cultures of supposedly open competition. The Medici have a meteoric rise in the papal court, for example. But mostly a papal court is a long game. And at each level that you see in this structure on your screen, whether you're blue, green, or red, you've got to live in a way that mirrors to observers within the court. It's a very hothouse environment in many ways. You need to demonstrate to them in the way you live your power, your wealth, and your aspiration, because you don't become pope without money. You don't become pope without knowledge, whether that's, head knowledge or kind of structural business acumen or political know-how. You need to be able to reflect who you are to the world in an outwardly sense. So in a court, whether it's a papal court or a royal court, or as we have in northern Italy at this time, duchies and counties, in a courtly society, the exterior is even more important because you signal through your exterior your interior ambition. So this kind of idea of how important the surface is in a courtly structure is enshrined in a work known as the Book of the Courtier, which was written about 1508 by a writer called Baldassare Castiglione. He came from Urbino, which was a ducal court, and he at first hand observed how courts were structured, what it was like to live in one, and how you could most easily move through and around and upwards through one. And he kind of condenses that knowledge in a dialogue known as the Book of the Courtier. And he says in that he really stresses how important the exterior is. So he says you're going to be judged by how you present to the world. So yes, the surface is important, but he also makes it clear that the surface has to reflect your interior. It is a reflection of your character and it works on your character. So how you look is not just superficial. People will read it as who you are. And so and your aspirations. So the surface is crucial. And he says what the surface should show the world are two key aspects of your character. One is he calls grazia, grace, but it means more than that. You have to be an elegant type of person. You have to have the right response in all kinds of situations. You always have to be appropriate and ready and measured and elegant and contained. But at the same time, no one wants to spend all of their time around a person like that because they do become superficial. It feels like you're spending time with someone who's coated in Teflon. In a modern sense, that's how we talk about truly political people. We see them as being just ciphers for a party line, and no one wants to spend time with that kind of a person. So yes, you need grazia or grace to excel, but you also need a light-heartedness, kind of a responsiveness, an ability to adapt in an unstudied way that Castiglione calls sprezzatura. Untranslatable word, just better to learn the word itself. Sprezzatura, beautiful example of Italian onomatopoeia, sounds like this kind of light-hearted explosion, and that's what it is. So sprezzatura is your ability to appear nonchalant, unstudied, adaptive to your circumstances in a light-hearted way, even though we all know that to do that, you actually have to be really well prepared. So it's often translated as studied nonchalance. So the kind of key, for me, the key example of a successful courtier, whether that's a courtier or a cardinal, a rung higher, or a pope, a rung higher again, is the swan. Because on the surface, you only see the grace, but below the surface are these ungainly, clumsy legs doing a lot of work in order to make the swan glide effortlessly across the surface of the pond. So the swan is a kind of a key example of those two things, grazia and sprezzatura. It's a studied nonchalance underpinning a natural kind of artifice or grace. A lot of work is required to get into one of these courts and to rise in it, to be able to move from lower rung courtier to, confidant of the cardinal, to the next candidate for that cardinalate, to someone whose name is thrown into the ring when the papal elections come up. Now, if you're familiar with this culture of the papal court in the Renaissance, which for political and historical reasons that I won't go into, really coalesces in the 16th century. So the Renaissance in Florence gets underway a little earlier, as we saw with Cosimo de' Medici and his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. But the magnificence of the papal court in Rome takes a bit longer to get underway and is really charging ahead in the 16th century, particularly in the middle of the 16th century. So if you're familiar with this Renaissance papal vogue for building villas and gardens, you're most likely to be familiar with Villa d'Este in Tivoli, which is a mid-16th century example of a papal calling card. This is constructed by Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, who in the middle of the 16th century is a pretender to the papal throne. He wants to be elected the next time there's a papal election. And when he takes refuge from Rome, because just like the Tuscan villas and the Borromean villa that we saw earlier, these cardinals' villas outside of Rome are still places of physical refuge, cooler in summer, less prone to malaria, nice places to spend time. They're not only that, they're also a calling card of your papal ambitions. So here I am, Ippolito d'Este, I'd like to be Pope. I've got to wine and dine and wheel and deal. And in summer, I don't want to do that in Rome because I'll get malaria or it'll be 40 degrees in Celsius and incredibly humid. Instead, I want to go somewhere pleasant to do that and create a beautiful natural environment, domesticated natural environment, of course, as we'll see. A garden is something man-made. But I want to create that kind of an environment in which to do the work that will make me Pope one day. To do this on this scale, there's 35,000 square meters of garden constructed by Cardinal d'Este. There are, I always have to write the figures down because who could remember these? There's over 200 meters of underground pipes to feed his fountains, 250 water jets, 50 fountains, 20 terraces. This is a sloping site, as you'll know if you've been to Villa d'Este in Tivoli. 15,000 perennial plants, 150 trees, 9,000 square meters of path. I mean, it's extraordinary, the scale of this. To be able to do this, I need money. I can't design it all myself. I don't have time. So I need a designer, a garden architect, really, to work it all out for me. He's got to be, goodness knows, very good at engineering because the hydraulic engineering for these fountains is all natural. It's just fed by the natural movement of the water downhill through pipes. So I'm displaying the extent of my power in the size of the garden. I'm showing the extent of my knowledge by hiring a cutting edge person to build it for me. In this case, I'm actually dominating the town. Ippolito d'Este had the town of Tivoli as part of his kind of cardinal's purse. And to build this garden and to feed its fountains, he diverts the source of drinking water for the people of the town into his fountains. So he's actually physically dominating the town. And as we're reminded so often in the viewpoints at Villa d'Este in Tivoli, He gives visitors to his garden a sweeping panorama of ambition because the garden sits on the side of the hill in Tivoli, and the extension of its viewpoint, the extension of the view you have from the garden is actually the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So it's not a very subtle statement. Come to my garden. Let me tell you about how I want to be Pope. And while you're here, have a look at, the place where I hope one day to reside, which is the Vatican. He also, as you can see, the terraced garden, as I said to you, if we go back to the plan of the garden, the structure, the villa itself, where if I'm visiting the cardinal, I'll spend time, is at the top of a very big hill. But the original entrance to the garden is not where it is today. Today, if you visit Villa d'Este, you start at the top where the villa is and you visit the garden in descent. But if you were visiting Ippolito d'Este, in the 16th century, your carriage dropped you at the bottom of this garden and you visited the garden in ascent, and he waited for you on the terrace at the top. So you arrive very hot and sweaty. It's summer, remember? It's spring and summer that you're in these gardens. You arrive very hot and sweaty and automatically put into an inferior kind of power dynamic with the owner of the villa as you arrive. These are the kinds of men who are building villas in the precincts of Rome. Where they build the villas in and around Rome, let's say Lazio, because they correspond to the present day Italian region of Lazio, as you can see on the map, they're building to the north and the south of Rome. And they're doing that because of the geography of Italy at this place. So to the north and the south of Rome are volcanic hills, hills that are today located, as you can see from the satellite view, around volcanic lakes. Some of those volcanic lakes are quite significant, as you can see on the map. They're quite large in size, and because they're volcanic lakes, the land that surrounds the lakes is quite high. So we're up in the hills, and then sunk in the hills, we have these, former kind of craters of ancient volcanoes that are now lakes. So in summer, these towns to the north and to the south of Rome are cooler because they're up in the hills. They have proximity to fresh water sources. The ground on which the very soil on which they're built is volcanic in origin. It's often very tufaceous, free draining kind of soil. So today you often get excellent wine grown in both these regions, north and south of Rome, for example. And they're thought of in the 16th century as being less prone to malaria than the kind of swampy, low-lying ground of Rome. So some of the cardinals' villas that we have in this period, in the Renaissance, in the 16th century, and then in the 17th century, the Baroque villas, are associated in the south with places like Tivoli and Frascati, and in the north of Rome, in places around Viterbo. Viterbo was a place that was historically very closely associated with the papacy. So they're not far from Rome, but they do have associations with Rome. So in the Alban Hills south of Rome, where Frascati, for example, is marked on the map you're looking at, you still have a very strong papal association. Of course, that's Castel Gandolfo. Whereas to the north of Rome, around Viterbo, there are a number of cardinals' villas, Renaissance villas, not only built by cardinals, I should say, that are strongly associated with Rome itself. So there are geological reasons that the villas and gardens are built where they are, and there's a political reason as well, because they're still within easy access of Rome. So in summer, the papal court goes into recess in these locations, but if they need to come back to Rome very quickly for a conclave, for example, they can do so. So there's this cluster to the north and south of Rome. And the two gardens that I want to focus on are associated with properties in the north. So one is marked on this map as Bomarzo, and the other is marked on this map as Bagnaia. We'll start with Bagnaia because it's much more of a typical Renaissance garden. It is a villa. So Bagnaia is the name of the town, and it was within the the cardinal's purse of a particular cardinal called Gianfrancesco Gambara. Gambara being, if you know modern Italian and you know the word for prawn, gambero. Gambara is a word for crayfish. So this is something that comes up in the garden. There's lots of sculpted crayfish, and that's because cardinal who instigated this garden was Cardinal Crayfish, let's call him. And then subsequently, his cardinal's purse passed to another cardinal after his death. This is the thing with the cardinals, villas, and gardens. Something to think about is that they're not hereditary. They're within the purse of the cardinalate. So sometimes they pass outside of the original owner. And that's what happens at Bagnaia. So the original villa is known as Villa Lante, constructed by Cardinal Crayfish. And then subsequently, the garden is extended and finished by another cardinal. Both of them have in their cardinalate the bishopric of Viterbo, that nearby, very strongly town very strongly associated with the papacy. And the second cardinal to extend this garden, a couple of generations after Cardinal Crayfish, is Cardinal High Mountain, or Cardinal Alessandro Montalto. So the two patrons of this garden are Cardinal Gambara and Cardinal Montalto. Montalto, High Mountain, one of the other symbols that you see in this garden on tops of fountains, for example, is a kind of a cluster of hills making one proud mountain surmounted by a cross. So in this garden, one looks for symbols of crayfish and symbols of strong mountains, high mountains, because both of those are puns on the names of the garden's patrons. The bones of this garden are laid out in the 1560s by a wonderful architect and garden designer and engineer. Vignola is his name. And there's a number of gardens, buildings and gardens designed by Vignola that survive. But for me, certainly Villa Lante for me is the cream of the crop. This is definitely for me my favorite of the works that he produced. What he designs for Cardinal Crayfish originally, and which is then extended by Cardinal High Mountain, is kind of a tour de force of working with a difficult site. I've said that these are volcanic hills. So just as we saw at Tivoli, pretty much every single one of these gardens has to accommodate a sloping site, which means earthworks. They've got to use engineering, but that's a con. Obviously, it's a lot more work to establish a garden on a sloping site. But in this period, it's a pro, because if you've got water at the top of the slope, then if you create a terraced garden, you've also got hydraulic engineering at your fingertips to be able to have waterworks. And the thing about these Renaissance gardens outside Rome is that, just like the ones we saw for the Medici family in Florence, they are a demonstration of what you can do. How can you work with nature, subdue it, and domesticate it for your benefit? These gardens are being used in summer, so water features are like natural air conditioning. If you are close to a fountain and it's not just a reflecting pool like the one you see on the screen now, which dates from the time of Cardinal High Mountain, let's call him, so later than the original garden. But if you're near a plashing fountain, hearing the water will make you feel cool. And in some cases, and in this garden, in fact, pretty much at the viewpoint where this photo was taken, some of these gardens incorporate water jets or games that were used by the cardinals to splash the unwitting visitors to their gardens with water. Very funny when a fellow cardinal sits down on a hidden button and activates a jet of water that drenches him. Haha, we all get to laugh at his expense, and I look very powerful, like I'm controlling nature, just like God does. They're not very humble statements being made in these gardens and their designs. But, it's summer, so probably being splashed with water is not such a bad thing when I'm wearing cardinal's robes. So the kind of natural disadvantages of some of these sites are then turned to extraordinary advantage and display. It's a statement of the cardinal's power and ambition, and also his taste, so his connoisseurship, that Cardinal Gambara knew to hire Vignola in order to design this garden for him is a sign of his connoisseurship. Now, the parterre at this garden is very striking. I always suggest that people visit this garden in the afternoon because a parterre is best seen when the light hits it from a raking perspective. That's when more shadows will be cast across the parterre. Try not to visit a parterre at midday. You want light to be coming in from an angle. But in the case of this parterre, just as we said at the Careggi villa in Florence, obviously it's a sloping site. The terraces do give me perspective over the parterre. They're beautifully designed. So progression of space is a really important principle within this garden. Elevation is very important. It gives me hydraulic engineering. It gives me perspective for appreciating a garden and a parterre in particular. It also takes into account the natural conditions of the site. But also a progression through space allows you, if you're Vignola, to control the experience of the visitor to the garden. This is also if you've visited Villa d'Este in Tivoli, which many people have. This is certainly something you get a sense of there as well. So how you visit these gardens is not being left to chance. Your progression through the garden is being controlled by its design. And the use of the terraces means that you are constantly transitioning between spaces, whether you go up or down, you're moving in a kind of a natural way through the garden. A natural way because it's extremely linear. So here's an early engraving of the garden. And as you can see from the more prominent entrance gate, again, like Villa d'Este, if you were visiting Cardinal Crayfish or Cardinal High Mountain, you would be dropped off at the bottom of the garden, make your way up through the garden to some pavilions that are right up the top of the garden. But that's not the only garden. So when you look at this image, your eye is drawn to the left of it and you can see a very structured garden. You'd recognize the parterre and fountain that I just showed you, seen from a different angle. But if you follow the perimeter wall in this engraving, you'll see that the garden is actually about almost 2/3 bigger than that part I've showed you so far. Because to our right, as we look at this image, most of the garden is made up by a fake wood or bosco. You can see it's fake because the trees are in such regular lines. So just like at Villa d'Este in Tivoli, trees have been planted. It is a garden, it's man-made. Trees have been planted to create a wild wood or a bosco. And here you can see it from a different angle. So in this case, we're hovering over the garden where the little red marker is that says A, where I'm circling is the entrance to the garden that you just saw from the other angle. And you move up through the garden to where I'm circling at the top. And you can see just how much surrounding that very structured part of the garden is wild wood or bosco. So automatically at this garden, there's a strong contrast between a structured, rigid, civilized space, which I've shown you earlier images of, and a wild, primitive, pagan space, which is the bosco. So how you move in this garden is controlled in those two ways by where you spend time. If you're in the bosco, you're still in a garden because that's not natural wood. It's not virgin forest. It's a planted wood made to look wild. So you're still in a garden that the cardinal has had made for you, but it's a rangy garden that tells a different, wilder story. And then when you move into the structured part of the garden, you're coming into a space that tells you a different story. And traditionally in Renaissance gardens, the closer you are to the residence, the more structured and civilized the space, and the further away you go, the wilder it becomes. So often, as you move in a linear fashion away from the villa, the space becomes wilder and wilder. And that's kind of happening here, but it's a difficult site to entirely control. So if we go back to the engraving, notice those two little villette, these two little cubey pavilions at the lowest part of the garden that we can see here, one of which was built by Cardinal Crayfish and the other is finished by Cardinal High Mountain. So they're perfect little twins. Those little pavilions where the cardinals could gather with friends and just hang around and enjoy themselves in the garden. That's a very structured part of the garden. But as you move up the terraces, it's becoming wilder and wilder, and it's almost like the civilized, structured part of the garden is a bastion in what is actually predominantly wild. There's more bosco than there is structured parterre, for example. So, what does that tell me as a visitor to this garden? It tells me that the space the cardinal has made and that I mostly spend time in with him is something that he has carved out from nature through sheer force of will and money and strength. He has created a haven of civilization and culture in an otherwise wild and pagan environment. It's a very strong kind of message to tell. And you might think I'm kind of laying this on, but if I put for you on the screen a plan of the garden, you'll see that it moves from Bosco, which is labeled for you on this image here, to up through the structured parterre of the garden to things like the table of the gods, which is a structure I'll show you in the middle in a moment in the middle of this image where I'm circling here, up an alley of trees to a kind of a primordial spring, which is being flooded. It's known as the Fountain of the Flood, which is being flooded in a kind of a Noah's Ark way. It's wild, uncontrolled nature, and every terrace, wild, uncontrolled nature drops down in this garden. The cardinal and his designer, Vignola, are doing more and more work to civilize nature and bring its power under control so that the overwhelming message of this garden is control. Some people, I love this garden. I think it's fabulous. It's not huge, as you will have divined from the satellite view, but I think it's just this perfect encapsulation of this Renaissance project. We're going to take wild and uncontrollable things, and because man is the measure of all things, we're going to be able to cut them down to size. But some people really don't respond to this garden for precisely that reason. You know, they see it in the same way as some people don't respond to a Zen garden or a bonsai plant in the Japanese gardening context. It's too much control of nature for them. They want to see nature doing its own thing, not being cut down to an appropriate size for people. But that's what the cardinals do in this garden in Bagnaia at Villa Lante. So the highest point in the garden, you have the Grotto of the Flood, as you see here. This is the source of all of the water in the fountains in this garden. And it starts dropping down in a linear fashion, as you can see, through channels and pipes and extraordinary rills of water that I'll show you in a moment. It drops down to a water table. I mean, it's actually a water table because if you look at it here, you could draw stools up to this stone table, which is fed by pipes dropping down with natural water pressure from the terraces above, from the Grotto of the Flood. You could sit alongside this table and eat off it and be cooling your bottles of wine in the channel of water that runs through it. And it doesn't end there, as you can see in the previous image. The water comes out the bottom of the water table where the cardinals would have their banquets and continues to step down through the garden. The steps down to me are some of the most beautiful parts of Villa Lante. So you see here what is called a rill. It's like it's a bit like a salmon ladder, isn't it? It's a kind of a very shallow stepped path for the water to follow. When there's a lot of water in this channel, you can see that there are kind of sculpted curlicues of stone that guide the water down the shallow steps. And if there was a lot of water, it might go out to the side so that this rill the water would actually have a shape on the sides, almost like, a child's drawing of a stream. This is one of the most, this type of structure is called a rill. This is one of the most famous rills in all of Italian garden design. And thanks to grand tours and artists visiting gardens like this, it becomes a very popular way of working with stepping water down through channels in gardens in France and in England as well. This is another way in which water can be dropped down. So this is the water being dropped down from the grotto of the flood down to the water table below. You can see here, very linear. The axes of these gardens, this one in particular, they're just perfectly observed. Notice the stone too. I think this was quite visible in the previous image. It's a very dark stone. This is a local volcanic stone. It goes by various names, but piperino is one of them, a kind of a pepper stone, as the name suggests. It's a gray stone when not wet. When it's wet, it gets a kind of a glossy black color and it looks a lot like granite, but isn't granite. Can be worked more easily than granite, so can be sculpted. We should never underestimate the contributions of sculptors to these gardens. Masons and sculptors working together with Vignola. So when it's used in a fountain, it looks like your entire fountain is made out of granite, which is very effective. And then following that central axis of the water, we are drawn inexorably by paths, but also by that straight line of the water itself down to the parterre or the water mirror, which also has a fountain in the center of it carved out of that same local stone that looks like granite when wet. Again, as I said, the symmetry of the garden, the civilized part of the garden is just extraordinarily well laid out. The two little villas, the squares of the parterre, the broderies inside the parterre, the circular fountain in the center of the square water table, and it's all on a perfect axis as we saw if we go back to the aerial image. It's all on a perfect axis from the grotto of the deluge, the grotto of the flood. So where my cursor is circling, the water starts here and it's what carves the axis through the middle of the garden down to the gate at the bottom of the garden where my cursor is circling. The water follows that axis, sometimes going underground, popping up then in things like the water table, and then flowing on down to the town below. So I tend to prefer Cardinal Crayfish to Cardinal d'Este in Tivoli because at least, the water is used here, but then it is given back to the town down below. Not the same cannot be said for Tivoli, where the water is diverted for the fountains and then runs out of town entirely, sadly, thus affecting the water source for the people, the 16th century inhabitants of Tivoli. So this garden at Villa Lante in Bagnaia, designed by Vignola for these two cardinals at the papal court in Rome, who were bishops of Viterbo, it's actually one of the most, people love to make grand statements. I'm going to say that for me, it's one of the most influential of the Renaissance gardens of Italy. So many times you will be somewhere and it has an echo of something to you, some beautiful structured garden. It has an echo that you can't quite identify. And for me, often that echo is Villa Lante. Just to give you one example, it's a very famous garden, quite hard to visit, on the outskirts of Florence, not far from Fiesole, a town called Settignano. And it was the residence of Bernard Berenson. And it is today the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. It's known as Villa I Tatti. And Villa I Tatti, when Berenson lived there, his wife commissioned the architect friend of her lover, to design a garden for her and her husband's villa. And that was Cecil Pinsent was the architect that she hired to design her garden. This is an aerial view of the garden at Villa I Tatti. Cecil Pinsent designed a whole series of lovely gardens in Italy that are very deeply informed by the Renaissance garden tradition. But for me, the garden at Villa I Tatti is very clearly a kind of an echo of the structure of the civilized part of the garden at Villa Lante in Bagnaia. So very influential garden there. But a garden that is built not far from Bagnaia at a place called Bomarzo, in exactly the same time, is a very different kind of Renaissance garden. It's not attached to a villa. So Bomarzo is a kind of an ancient feudal town. You can see it in a postcard at the top left. And the residence of the Lord of Bomarzo was up in the town on a tufa outcrop. But below it, in a tufa valley, the Lord of Bomarzo in the middle of the 16th century, Pier Francesco Orsini, decides to build a park, let's call it. It's not really a garden. A garden is something that in the Italian tradition is attached to a residence. And there's no structure attached to the garden constructed by Orsini. So it's better thought of as a park. Probably the designer of this garden is the same person who designed Villa d'Este in Tivoli. And that's quite remarkable because as if you know Villa d'Este, you're going to see that this garden, possibly designed by the same person, Piero Ligorio, is a very different kind of garden. Piero Ligorio was an antiquarian and an art historian and a philosopher and scholar and teacher. He was the kind of head of papal archaeological excavations in the 16th century. He's an extraordinarily erudite figure. You feel that in the garden at Tivoli in Villa d'Este, which has such strong connections visually and in its design principles to the villa of Hadrian down below in the plain at Tivoli, which in fact Piero Ligorio was chief surveyor of for the Pope. And here in Bomarzo, we have something very different. It goes by a lot of names. It's sometimes called the Parco dei Mostri, the Park of the Monsters. And the owners, the patrons' intention was really that it be known as a sacred wood or Sacro Bosco. So it's a garden in a very different sense. It is a garden because it's entirely man-made. But as you'll see, it's not like the other gardens we'll look at. And there's a very evocative picture of it in the bottom right of your screen because this is a garden that has been recently rediscovered. Until the middle of the 20th century, as you see in that image, it had been abandoned. It was being used as pasture, and it is only thanks to the work of the still to this day private owners of the sacred wood that it has been brought back to the original vision. Pier Francesco Orsini, who is more commonly known as Vicino, let's just call him Orsini, or if I were to translate his name like I had for crayfish and high mountain, we'd have to call him neighbor or little bear because Vicino means neighbor or close by, and Orsini, that family's name, comes from the idea of little bears. So there are quite a few bears to look for in this garden. We saw crayfish and strong mountains at Villa Lante, and in this garden you should look for bears. There's a few of them dotted around. So Orsini builds this garden really as a project of mourning. It's part of his grief. So he had been a military leader, a condottiero, someone who strategizes military battles for payment. And it seems to be the case that his wife, who was from an equally ancient Roman dynasty, the Farnese family, Giulia Farnese, seems to have died around about the time that he commissions this garden, and he seems to have seen the whole project of the sacred wood as a spiritual, pagan, really important, pagan, but spiritual project connected to the journey of the soul of his dead wife. So it's a garden that has a very heavy kind of purpose. We think, as I said, that Piero Ligorio designs this, and we think that despite not having, signed contracts, which would be helpful, we think that because of the type of garden this is, it's a garden with strong classical allusions that in a sophisticated way sets out a story that accomplishes quite an important and sophisticated purpose. So this is not just a place to go and here's a jet of water, you're wet now, have a glass of wine from the water table and have a think about my power and wealth and the way I can dominate the world around me, which is really the story that Villa Lante tells. in a sophisticated and complex way, but that's essentially the story. This is a garden that tells us a different story, a much more personal story, and it tells a personal story on a huge scale, so on a grand mythological scale. Garden building is in this family's blood because, in fact, Vicino's daughter marries into the Ruspoli family, and she is the patron of an extraordinary parterre garden in a very awkward space at a place called Vignanello, which is another beautiful Renaissance garden that you might want to look at. Essentially, the space separate to the town, so it's not a villa garden, but the space carved out for this garden by the Orsini is like a quarry. It's been used as a quarry because of the tufaceous stone, which we also saw it at Bagnaia just in the previous garden at Villa Lante. So it's a place that's been used as a quarry because the stone is useful and it's soft enough to carve out. But what Orsini does and what his garden designer does is maximize a space that is like a quarry, if you look at that modern photo in the bottom right, and use that to create a sculpture park. And really, the best way, probably for us in a modern sense, to think about the sacred wood is to think of it as a sculpture park. Because the structures within this garden, some of which are sculptures, and some of which, as you see here, are buildings, are constructed from the stone quarried in the site. So they haven't brought the blocks of this temple in from somewhere else. They've taken them from the site, they've quarried them on site and built the structure here. So this building in the site is now used as a chapel, very iconic Renaissance design for this little building, is used as a chapel today. There are members of subsequent generations of the Orsini family buried here, but probably not intended as a tomb for Giulia Farnese, but it is built from materials quarried from the site itself. Just as at Villa Lante and at Villa d'Este, by following a course through the garden that its designer established kind of constrains you to follow when you visit, and therefore unfolds a story and, importantly, a way of experiencing and looking at the garden as well, forces that upon you. The Sacro Bosco, the sacred wood, also wants you to understand a story by the way it constrains you to visit the site. And you visit the site like you would visit a contemporary sculpture park. That is, you encounter as you move through it sculptures carved out of the very site that have inscriptions on them that tell you, both through what the sculpture represents and what the sculpture is inscribed to say, tell you how to understand the site. So this is a sphinx who greets you close to the entrance to the garden. And she's inscribed with sayings that, they sound like they come out of something, written by Sophocles or Euripides, but they were purpose-written inscriptions for this garden to tell the story that Orsini wants you to hear. And that is, O ye who enter here, and use thy wit to try to understand what thou shalt see from beginning to end. Tell me if so many marvels were created to make thee or for art. It kind of sets you up to enter this garden and just know, however you're approaching this, however you think you're going to understand this, it's going to be a very hard puzzle for you to make out. Think about the Sphinx, she posed the great riddle. What goes on 4 legs, 2 legs, and then 3 legs? People who end their life with a stick, their 3rd leg. So just like the Sphinx poses riddles, this Sphinx poses you a riddle as you enter, and she says to you, is the whole point of this garden to make you stray, or is it just about art? What's the purpose of this garden? You're going to try and use head knowledge or wit, but really you're going to be bombarded with wondrous things, and that's going to make it very hard for you to work out the ultimate purpose of what you're here to see. He who does not go there with eyes wide open and lips sealed, look, don't speak, will not be able to admire the most wonderful marvels. So your visiting conditions are being imposed on you by the sculptures and the inscriptions as you enter. Some of the sculptures in this garden, again, remember, carved out of local stone, seem to tell a specific story. Elephants have long been used in battle in ancient times. And, what happens here, what's happening here is the warrior who would have been in the kind of poop castle on the back of the elephant, is he being assisted up and down by the elephant? Or has the elephant actually bested the warrior who was controlling him? So the warrior controls the elephant to go into battle. But what do we see here is the elephant actually controlling the warrior. Nothing can resist he who goes directly and relentlessly. The elephant pursues its goal, slow and steady, and ultimately that's who manages to triumph, not the person who appears. Remember, Orsini was himself a military strategist by trade. The person who appears to be directing the flow of action, who actually comes out on top in the end? Is it the person apparently directing the control of action, or is it the person being controlled? This sculpture suggests that the dominated can, in the end, be the dominator. Other sculptures, they don't really seem to tell us anything clearly, and these are all supra life size. These are all bigger than life size, these sculptures. But they tell an increasingly mysterious story that has to do with brute force and the limits of brute human force. So here you have two giants understood to be, on the left, understood to be telling you a story of a struggle between Hercules and the giant carcass in the labors of Hercules. I've given you an image here that shows you some people looking at those two giants wrestling at the bottom right of that image on the left to give you a sense of scale. That's how big they are. These are monolithic sculptures. So the brute strength of the struggle between Hercules and Cacus, but arguably Hercules only accomplished all of his labors because he used his brain as much as he used his brawn. So humans can do these very violent and physically controlling things to one another, but we've also got that elephant sculpture, which seems to suggest that it's not that easy, that sometimes the thing that appears to be the passive force is ultimately the enduring and triumphing force. Passivity and activeness are two really important ideas for this garden. I talked about them when I was talking about the trend of Renaissance villas and gardens, that just as in ancient Rome, Renaissance Italians of a certain social class and level of power set out to balance the active dimensions of their life, like business and politics, with the passive or contemplative aspects of their life. And for me, one of the beauties of the sacred wood is that you have this, this is a giant sculpture of a river god. This is a giant sculpture of a sleeping woman entering the kingdom of dreams, so evocative. These giant sculptures, now that the site has been rehabilitated, are slipping back into a woodland environment. So when the site was grazed, it looked like the quarry that it essentially is. But now that it has been replanted with the kinds of trees that it would originally have had, these sculptures are kind of being submerged by the natural environment around them. Remember, it's a created natural environment, so it is a garden in that sense. Man has planted these trees to swallow these sculptures, and you can see the sculptures here are growing moss, and moss initially, unless the site is kept quite moist, moss is also a cultivated thing. There are, a number of Japanese gardens, for example, where moss has been, carefully planted and cultivated in order to create the effect of something strong being inexorably, so almost passively subsumed by the active force of something else. So for me, the way these giant sculptures at the Sacred Wood slip back into nature, being swallowed up by nature, is a very attractive part of this garden. The again, question that it has for you, what is stronger, the active force or the passive force? Is life stronger or is death stronger? If you think about this as a garden of grief and a working out of grief, those that active and passive struggle of our lives will ultimately be resolved by death. And which is stronger, the active life that we've lived or the death that swallows us up? Here I am kind of puzzling this out in this philosophical way, but what the garden, remember, tells you over and over is don't try and make a rational sense of this. So this is a very famous sculpture within the garden, a kind of an ogre's mouth, which, by the way, the glottis of the throat there is actually a picnic table, which I love. It's inscribed, abandoned thought, or you who enter, which is a quote from Dante. Dante's Divine Comedy, hell starts with abandon hope, all ye who enter. But instead here we're told abandon thought. Don't try and make sense of this. The more you try to make sense of this garden, the more the Sacred Wood will destabilize you. For me, that's its central goal. The central goal of this garden is to make you unsteady. Have you gone through life thinking that brute force will win, like a military strategist might have gone through his life thinking? Wrong. The elephant wins in the end. Have you gone through life thinking that you're on a steady footing? Go inside the crooked house and you will realize you're not on a steady footing. This is not a ruin. That building is not falling over. It was built to lean like this. And you would imagine looking at this, that the floor tilts on the same angle as the building is tilted. But when you go inside this, I can't go inside it for long. It gives me vertigo. Actually, the floor has been built up in different places in different ways. So where you feel like you should go up, you go down, and where you feel like you'll walk down, you find yourself walking up. It throws you off your center of gravity. And I think the point of this garden is it takes the Renaissance expectations and it turns them on its head. You know, even that chapel, that's a hedge next to this chapel. It's a hedge that needs a trim in this image. You can see from the steps, the chapel's very small. The total height of the chapel when you climb up the steps to it is not much greater in that colonnaded loggia. It's not much higher than your head height. But the sense of this building is that it's much more imposing than it is. Actually, when you look at it from the side, it's disproportionate. Think about that hedge. That hedge is about as tall as I am. So all of the kind of human scale that we expect, which is what we found at Villa Lante and what we found in Villa d'Este, those are villas and gardens on a human scale, a grand and monumental human scale that says, I am dominating the natural landscape through my wealth and power. When you come to the Sacred Wood, a lot of those Renaissance conventions about man as the measure of all things are turned on their head. Your expectations are disrupted. And so I love visiting those two gardens in one day, Villa Lante in Bagnaia and the Sacred Wood in Bomarzo, because they destabilize your expectations of what the Renaissance is all about. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you have the opportunity to visit some of these beautiful gardens in Italy. Thanks very much.